Thanks for braving the holiday traffic. For about the next 20 minutes, Paul and I are going to have a conversation, and then we're going to throw it out to all of you to continue that conversation. By way of background, Cass Sunstein, the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School, some of you may know him, he's also a member of the APS, published a review of You Bet Your Life in the New York Times this past fall. And his review was titled, A History of Medical Innovation That Doesn't Ignore the Side Effects. In framing our conversation this evening, and these are Sunstein's statements, not mine, following Hippocrates, doctors often pledge to do no harm. But if they took that pledge seriously, countless life-saving innovations would never have been possible. Offit wants to understand the failures and tragedies that help pave the way to medical innovation. Offit's a great storyteller. In the domain of medical innovation, tragedies cannot be prevented, no matter how many regulations we put into place. New technologies are always a gamble. The precautionary principle, if you will, which essentially calls for a high degree of risk aversion, in its extreme form may be self-defeating, resulting in slowed down innovations that ultimately were a great boon to humanity. The learnings from innovations occur in real time. We may have to roll the dice with our lives. For those of you here tonight who have not read the book, it's divided into 3 parts. And those 3 parts focus on risk, oversight, and serendipity. Offit discusses the risks associated with the innovations of heart transplants, blood transfusions, and anesthesia in Part 1. In Part 2, he dedicates chapters to the development of biologicals, antibiotics, vaccines, and X-rays. And lastly, in Part 3, the chapters highlight the developments of chemotherapy and gene therapy, ending with a chapter on living with uncertainty. Clearly, this book provides a particular narrative of the tragedies associated with medical breakthroughs. Before I open this conversation up tonight to you, let me kick things off with a few questions that I'd like Paul to comment on. So in the broader context, you've noted this story speaks to the human price paid for knowledge and how big of a price we're willing to pay. Can you comment on this, and how is this relevant to the current vaccine trials for COVID?
Right. So I guess when we were looking at these COVID vaccines in development, say, a year ago, May, August, September, before the vaccines were presented to our FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee in December, what was upsetting to me to some extent was that the CEOs of the companies, when they would do the phase 1 trials, which are really just basically dose-ranging trials, I mean, what dose of this mRNA vaccine or what dose of this vectored virus vaccine from Johnson & Johnson should we use, there would be studies of 10 people, 15 people, 25 people. And the CEOs would go on television and say, we can make tens of millions of doses. This is going to be great. And there was just such an utter lack of humility. I remember saying that actually on one of the CNN shows. I think it was Inside Politics with John King. Where's the humility here? Because there has never been a medical innovation where there has not been some sort of human price to pay. And you learn as you go, and invariably it is something you never anticipated. And that was true here. I mean, you would have never anticipated that the mRNA vaccines would cause, for example, myocarditis. You would never have anticipated these adenovirus vectored vaccines like the J&J vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine would cause severe and occasionally fatal blood clots by a mechanism that would have never been anticipated. That's always true. So keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, basically, and pay attention to what's about to happen. I think that's sort of how I was struck by that when that was being developed. Just this hubris. I felt that they suffered the sin of hubris.
At the FDA and the Centers for Devices and Radiologic Health, where I do some work, there's a saying that just we keep relearning. New devices bring new failure modes, new unanticipated failure modes. I know that you have a personal connection to the polio story, and you've suggested that there are analogies of today's COVID vaccine story to the polio story. I'd like you to comment on how these two are related. When I think of the polio story, I see heartbreaking pictures of children in large hospital wards in iron lungs. If COVID primarily affected large numbers of children like polio did, would the COVID story be different, and maybe how would it be different?
Right. I think the polio story, comes up in COVID in a couple ways. The first is when Jonas Salk made his polio vaccine, which he started working in the late 1940s up into the 50s. What he did was he took polio virus, grew it up in cells, purified it, and then inactivated the virus completely with a chemical, formaldehyde. What he then did was he inoculated about 700 children in and around the Pittsburgh area, found that he could induce an excellent immune response, which he thought would be protective, and that at least in those 700 children, the vaccine was saved. And to him, that was enough. He thought, here's a virus that that's paralyzing 20 to 30,000 children every year. Here's a virus that's killing 1,500 children every year. Let's get it out there. But that's not what the March of Dimes had in mind. The March of Dimes wanted to do a big clinical trial, and it broke his heart. What they did was they took first and second graders in the United States, and you all remember this well. I certainly remember it well. And they gave those first 420,000 first and second graders got the vaccine, 200,000 got placebo, and 1.2 million served as observed uninoculated controls. He could not conscience giving children a placebo vaccine in the 1950s, knowing that every year this virus did what it did. And so when the trial was over, Thomas Francis, who was headed the trial at the University of Michigan, he stood at the podium at Rackham Hall and said those three famous words: safe, potent, and effective. And those three words were in the headline of every newspaper in this country. And church bells rang out, and synagogues held special prayer meetings, and department stores stopped when that announcement was made. And the Voice of America carried that announcement over to Europe. And I remember my mother actually crying when this moment happened in April of 1955. I was 4 years old. And I had been in a polio ward, actually, when I was 5 years old. And I certainly remember what polio looked like. I remember iron lungs. I remember children in traction. I remember all the hot compresses by Sister Kenny, et cetera. And so how did he know it was effective? The way that Thomas Francis knew that vaccine was effective because 16 children died of polio in that study, all in the placebo group. He knew it was effective because 36 children had gotten permanently paralyzed for the rest of their lives, 34 in the placebo group. But for the flip of a coin, those children could have lived long and fulfilling lives. I was a first and second grader in the 1950s. They would have been roughly my age, but for that flip of a coin. And I think where this comes up with the COVID story is when our committee recommended, for example, the vaccine for the 12 to 15-year-old, I got a lot of hate mail from people who said, really, the trial that was done for that 12 to 15-year-old group was basically a 2,400 child trial. 1,200 got vaccine, 1,200 got placebo. There were 18 cases of COVID in that trial, all in the placebo group. And so people wrote me and said, 2,400 children, really? That's all you want to test? When Pfizer did its trial, for example, in adults, they did 40,000 adults. And now you're going to say that for tens of millions of children between 12 and 15 years of age, you are making a decision based on 2,400 children? And so the answer to that question is you could do a 24,000 child trial, and then there wouldn't have been 18 children with COVID in the placebo group. There would have been 180. What price do you want to pay? What human price do you want to pay for knowledge? Because that's always the question. How big of a human price do you want to pay? And then the other aspect of this story, which is remarkably similar to the COVID story, was the way that vaccine was made. I mean, that was, the polio vaccine in 1955 was Operation Warp Speed 1. This COVID vaccine is Operation Warp Speed 2. I mean, the March of Dimes paid for that research. They paid for Jonas Salk's research and other researchers. They paid those companies to mass produce those vaccines at risk. Those companies didn't pay for it. And they paid for the vaccine as it was distributed to first and second graders. What happened was 5 companies stepped forward to make it, to make that vaccine. 2 of them were veteran vaccine makers, Eli Lilly, Park Davis. 3 of them weren't. 3 of them were sort of novel vaccine makers. One of them, Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, made it badly. What they failed to do, I don't know if you remember this story, because it sort of was you remember the story, but it was sort of hidden at some level. Cutter Laboratories failed to fully inactivate the vaccine. As a consequence, 120,000 children were inadvertently inoculated with live, fully virulent polio virus. About 40,000 of those children were permanently paralyzed. It actually started a polio epidemic because those who were paralyzed shed virus, and so others in the home could get it. 164 children, I'm sorry, there were 40,000 children were partially paralyzed, had so-called abortive polio. 164 were permanently paralyzed for the rest of their lives, and 10 were killed. I think it was probably the worst biological disaster in this country's history. And I don't know if you remember this, but the polio program was shut down for 2 months. Right after it was announced that here this vaccine worked and was safe in mid-April 1955, that program was shut down. While companies then figured out what had gone so horribly wrong. Because the problem was mass production. The problem was scale up. That was the issue, which it came up with a problem here to some extent. With some of these vaccines, you saw that there were problems with scale up. That's probably the hardest part of making vaccines is not making hundreds of doses during your phase 1 or 2 trials. It's making tens of millions of doses that you're then going to distribute to the United States or to the world. And so the polio program shut down for two months while they figured out what would happen. Cutter never made another vaccine again. That was the last they were involved. But Wyeth also made a vaccine that paralyzed and killed children. It was the scale-up incident. And, you know, we learned as we went, and ultimately it didn't really have a major impact on the uptake of that vaccine. Imagine if something like that would have happened today.
So I'm going to bring you back to the chapter on heart transplants with my next question. And looking at the learnings that you've chronicled and moving forward, should we expect and accept that the bar is lowered when advancing medical innovation in terms of perhaps risk mitigation when the potential subjects are facing imminent loss of their life, like a patient who desperately needs a heart transplant and it's never been done before?
Right. Well, so sort of going back to the first heart transplant, because it's actually relevant, because I don't know if you remember the first heart transplant, it was done by a South African physician whose name was Christian Barnard. He became arguably the most famous physician in the world. I mean, he visited the Pope, he visited presidents of states, he became the boyfriend of Gina Lollobrigida. I mean, that's how good it got for him. And so the heart transplant, and this was the first human-to-human heart transplant. There had been animal-to-human heart transplants, sort of baboons, chimps into humans, but this was the first human-to-human heart transplant. And Louis Washkansky was the sort of a Lithuanian man who lived in South Africa, who was really at the end of his life. I mean, he was severely debilitated. He was at death's door. So for him, that was an easy decision. The term Christian Barnard used was, at the time, was that, you know, you're not going to be willing to swim across a river full of alligators unless there's a lion chasing you. And that's sort of how he described this man's choice to get a heart transplant, because it was such an unknown procedure. Although he did assure Louis Washkansky's wife, Anne, that this would go well, which kind of upset her since there had never been a transplant like that before. And how long did Louis Washkansky live? He lived 18 days, and that was considered a success. And we stumbled along with that. So today, putting it sort of fast forwarding it to today, there are 4,000 people on the heart transplant waiting list. 1,300 of those people will die while waiting. If you know that you're going to be one of those 1,300 people, would you be willing to get a pig heart as a transplant, knowing that there was recently a pig kidney that was transplanted successfully into people? You can genetically engineer pigs so that you're much less likely to reject that transplant because you won't see it as foreign. But there will be a learning curve with pig hearts, much as there'll be a learning curve for the pig kidneys as we move forward. So that's always the question. If you're about to cross a bridge and you know that it's a rickety old bridge and you're not sure how much it's going to hold up, but there's a safer bridge 3 miles down the road, you're willing to go to that safer bridge 3 miles down the road. But if you know the lion's chasing you, you're going to cross that rickety bridge, and I think that's what's true in a lot of things today, where people have, in the case of, say, needing a heart transplant, have to make that kind of decision, because there really are never risk-free choices, just choices to take different risks, and you have to try and evaluate the best you can what those risks are. Tell me when I've completely depressed you, but yeah.
I'd like to give you the opportunity to comment about the Jesse Gelsinger gene therapy tragedy that occurred in September of 1999. This was clearly a Philadelphia story. It certainly affected all of us at Penn who were doing first in man as well as safety and efficacy clinical trials. It's a wonderful chapter. It describes how that event destroyed the careers of some physicians, but there was a positive spin to it, which I thought you articulated very well. So I'd love to hear your comments.
Right, I'm sure Anna remembers the story well. So Jesse Gelsinger was a 19-year-old boy who lacked a particular liver enzyme, such that that he needed to have a special diet. He needed to take as many as 30 pills a day, which as a teenager was a lot to ask. And so as a consequence, when he didn't do that, when he went off his diet or refused to take those medicines, he would lapse into a coma as the ammonia would build up in his bloodstream. Ammonia, no different than the ammonia you would use to scrub a floor. And so he was interested, as was his father, in the gene therapy program headed by Dr. Jim Wilson here at the University of Pennsylvania in Worcester. He was the way that program was done was that the vector that was used to introduce the gene that he lacked into his liver cells was actually put into a replication defective adenovirus, actually virtually identical to the replication defective adenoviruses that are used today in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or in the vaccine made by AstraZeneca, or in the vaccine that's used actually in Russia, also uses replication defective adenoviruses. And Jim Wilson, to his credit, now the quantity of virus that was used in those experiments is probably 300-fold greater than the quantity of vaccine that you would be getting if you got Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. But what Jim Wilson did correctly was he slowly went up on the dose. He had, a number of people, say 6, 10 people per group, and he would slowly go up on the dose to make sure that there was no evidence of problems, especially any evidence of any liver damage or any other cellular damage, and he slowly proceeded. What happened when he got to Jesse Gelsinger, who was the second person actually to receive that dose, there was also a young woman who had received the same dose that didn't have a problem. But what happened when Jesse Gelsinger got it is he had an overwhelming immunological reaction, acting as if he had a severe bacterial infection, so-called bacterial sepsis. He went to the intensive care unit at HUP and ultimately was overwhelmed and died. And nobody knew why. It was unclear why. And Jim Wilson was vilified for that. I mean, it was brought up that there were some monkeys that had a problem, although the problem that those monkeys had was not the problem that Jesse Gelsinger had. People felt that here was an example of man acting as God, and that this boy who could have lived a reasonably long life had he stuck to his diet and his pills was killed because of Jim Wilson's hubris, which wasn't fair. I think that he was unfairly vilified for this. What ended up happening was, to Jim Wilson's credit, he stuck to it, even though he was a pariah. I mean, he was no longer invited to any gene therapy meetings. He was brought up in front of a committee at the sort of recombinant advisory committee at the NIH and treated badly. But to his credit, he really hung in there. And then, because he wanted to figure out what happened. I mean, what went wrong? And ultimately, I think that the understanding was that there was actually a particular protein that is made by the immune system called interleukin-6 that had been aberrantly made in large quantities that overwhelmed him. Now, had he known that at the time, it wouldn't have mattered. And there was not, at that time, a monoclonal antibody directed against that protein, which does exist today, so-called tocilizumab. And so what happened then, years later, was, and Anna I know knows this story, Emily Whitehead was a little girl at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia who had leukemia. And so she was treated with something called CAR T therapy, where basically you take the T cells out of her body, T cells that have the capacity to kill cells, so-called cytotoxic T cells, engineer it so that it can then kill her leukemia cells and re-put it back in her body. And then what happened was she had the same reaction that he had. And the physicians at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia recognized that. The difference is that now there was a monoclonal antibody directed against IL-6. And so when they saw that her interleukin-6 levels were sky high, they gave her that monoclonal antibody and saved her life. And that's become in many ways part of routine therapy now for the so-called CAR T therapy that was pioneered by Carl June and others at the University of Pennsylvania. What strikes me about this is that if you go to those CAR T labs, what you see are pictures of Emily Whitehead. I mean, she was celebrated. She went and visited Obama. She was on NBC in the morning, like Dateline NBC. She was celebrated as the success that she was. I mean, she was a breakthrough figure in gene therapy. But what you never see are any pictures of Jesse Gelsinger. I mean, we are much more comfortable celebrating our successes and not realizing that it's only the failures, really, that lead to those successes.
So I have one more question before I open it up to the audience. And to be fair, I have to credit my wife with this question, who's a historian. But it's a question that maybe was not addressed in this book. And when thinking about the historical path of medical innovation, there's also the aspect of human cost across race, class, and gender. Has everybody paid the same price? Do you believe medical innovation today is appropriately focused on the importance of equity and inclusiveness compared to the stories that you highlight in the book? Are we making any progress?
To some extent, yes. I mean, certainly the FDA requires vaccine trials to look like the makeup of the American public in terms of representing African Americans, Hispanic community, et cetera, so that the ethnic and racial mix has to look like America. But, I mean, if you look, for example, at the trials that are being done currently for children, the centers where you then can easily go and participate in those trials are generally not in African American communities. So I think it makes it harder, actually, for those groups to participate in this. So, I mean, we still obviously have a long way to go. I think the good news is we're much more sensitive to this now than we have been in the past.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. I see a hand going up from Dr. Clyde Barker. Many of you know Dr. Clyde Barker. He is the transplant house at Penn is named after Clyde. He did the first kidney transplant in Philadelphia many years ago. Clyde, it's all you.
This was not really a topic of your conversation this afternoon, although it was a topic of the book. And the question that I've been thinking about is when something bad happens, it's usually magnified to the extent that people hear about it by the press. So they participate in the blame that is attached to the people who are the authors of the breakthrough.
Can't hear you.
I don't think I can go through it again.
Go for it.
The press deserves to have some blame for the destruction of careers, such as Jim Wilson's, and other bad things that happen to people who have achieved these breakthroughs. And being Can you hear me now? All right, I'll start in the middle. Being a surgeon, and above that a transplant surgeon, I can tell you that the people who were responsible for these breakthroughs, because I have known some of them, have confidence, aggressiveness, arrogance, whatever you want to call it. They are people who want to be first. Now, to the extent that, and I'm not sure that I'd put Wilson in that category, but some of the others, it's pretty obvious. To the extent that the surgeon or the scientist can avoid this impression of arrogance, is that going to mollify the blame that is attached by the press, or is it just inevitable?
I think it's inevitable. I think that when something bad happens, everyone would like to believe that it was anticipatable. Everybody would like to believe that this was something you could have figured out, because that way we figure that there is some level of control, which doesn't frankly exist, but it enables us to feel better about this. I mean, it creates a narrative that makes us feel better that this person screwed up, and that's why this happened, because otherwise what you're left with is that this is the inevitable consequence of learning as we go. You learn as you go. You pay a price. I mean, I think if I asked everybody in this audience, do you think we're going to know more about science and medicine 100 years from now than we know now? I think everybody would say yes. But the fact is that when it comes to your disease or your procedure, you want to believe that we know everything we need to know now when we don't. And that's always that's why we're drawn to the guru. We're drawn to the Deepak Chopras, the Mehmet Oz's, soon to be your state senator, because they don't express doubt. I mean, I think we like, it's what I call the Bones-McCoy seduction. I don't know if you remember Star Trek with the USS Enterprise. Well, the chief medical officer was Bones McCoy. So he would have this tricorder. And when you were sick, he would sort of scan you up and down, and he would look at this, and that's what you had. It's very reassuring. It's not in any sense real in the world of medicine, right? Because there's so much we don't know that we have to learn. But it provides a narrative that is comforting, that this was a mistake and it could have been avoided. I think that's just my opinion.
Well, if it's inevitable, then is it absolutely necessary to continue to have these breakthroughs, that those who are going to make them will have this, whatever this trait is, arrogance, confidence, aggressiveness, whatever you call it, must that be part of the makeup of the people who are successful?
I think it's invariably true. I mean, you look at Christian Barnard. I mean, he was certainly, if you know his story, was a very arrogant person. People didn't like him, and but maybe that is what it took to take a heart from somebody and put it into somebody else, knowing that it had never been done before. I think, but again, I'm just my opinion, yeah.
From the patient side of the story, I was a kid in the 1950s, and I got the Salk shot, and I remember the community excitement, national excitement.
You know, I think you can take your mask off for a moment. While
I remember the national excitement, and no anti-vaxxers or any of that sort. But then a couple years later, the Sabin sugar cube delivery system came along, and I think I got that too. And as an official hater of needles, I mean, that was kind of a big event, et cetera.
And lover of sugar cubes, right?
Yeah. I wonder if you could kind of fill in the, the narrative of the transition from one to the other, because I certainly had no technical understanding of it.
Sure. So Jonas Salk's vaccine was a whole-killed viral vaccine. It was used in this country from 1955 till roughly 1962, 1963. The reason that Sabin's vaccine replaced that was that there was a belief, and it was a false one, that the only way you could have long-lived immunity was to be basically either naturally infected, which comes with the price of natural infection, or vaccinated with a live, weakened form of the virus. That was the only way to have long-lived immunity. Now, that was wrong. And Jonas Salk had showed that that was wrong, showed that you had a so-called memory response, even by just getting 3 doses of his whole inactivated polio vaccine. But nonetheless, that was the dogma. A dogma that was in part created and nurtured by Albert Sabin, but a dogma that was wrong. And so thus, Albert Sabin's vaccine replaced Jonas Salk's vaccine. And we used Albert Sabin's vaccine in this country from 1962 to the year 2000. The reason we ultimately replaced Albert Sabin's vaccine with Salk's vaccine was that Albert Sabin's vaccine had a rare but real side effect, one that he went to his grave denying, which is that every year in this country, 8 to 10 children would be paralyzed by the polio vaccine, so-called vaccine-associated paralytic polio. It was rare, but it was real. It occurred in maybe 1 per 2.4 million doses, but it was real. And for that reason, we went back to the inactivated vaccine. It was interesting, I was actually on the so-called Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices to the CDC at the time, and I was the head of the polio working group. And it was hard to get people to go back to the inactivated vaccine because of the Cutter incident. I mean, that still scared them. Although we eliminated polio from the United States, natural polio, wild-type polio, by the late 1970s. And so for 2 decades, the 80s and the 90s, the only polio caused in this country was caused by the polio vaccine. And you had other countries, Scandinavian countries, that had only used Salk's vaccine, had never used Sabin's vaccine, and eliminated polio from their country. So therefore, it became an intolerable risk to have that even a rare risk, but nonetheless an intolerable risk because the risks outweigh the benefits.
Great question.
Thanks. I have 2 questions. One very specific, which was it Jesse Glickman?
Gelsinger.
Gelsinger, I'm sorry. Is there now a treatment for the disease that he had? Or did that failure kind of stop all experimentation?
No. I think certainly gene therapy took a hit with that. I mean, it really set gene therapy back for years. But still, I think that for his defect was so-called ornithine transcarbamylase enzyme deficiency, for which I think what we've learned is there are much better vectors than the one that he used. So for example, what's interesting is that when that happened, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth by NIH, the Recombinant Advisory Committee, and there were all these rules put in place by Donna Shalala when she was head of Health and Human Services to make sure it never happened again, to make sure that kind of tragedy never happened again, which can never happen. It doesn't matter how many regulations you put in place, tragedies happen, and that's what did happen. There were French researchers that used a different vector, a so-called retrovirus vector. So for example, human immunodeficiency virus is a retrovirus, but most retroviruses are benign. The advantage of retroviruses is they insert themselves directly into the DNA. And so French researchers used a retrovirus vector to treat children who had something called severe combined immune deficiency disease when you're born basically without a functioning immune system. And it looked good, except what happened was on one of the early patients, the vector inserted itself right in front of a gene that put the child at risk for leukemia. And so a child got leukemia and then died. And there were several children in that initial retrovirus trial that got leukemia because of the retrovirus vector. And so we learned then to put an insulator gene there so that that never happened again. But there's no legislating away the learning curve. That was actually originally the title of the book, was The Learning Curve. We don't want to believe there's a learning curve. We want to believe that we know everything. I mean, there's a lot of people who are angry about myocarditis or angry about the clotting disease associated with J&J's vaccine. But, it's just you learn as you go. So be open-minded to that.
Yeah, and my other question is about mRNA. I'm a historian, so I know absolutely nothing. How this technology, is it going to change the way vaccines or the diseases vaccines can treat? Are we going to go back and redo vaccines for rotavirus or other things that we get? Is it better technology, or is it just a different technology that's being applied to COVID? And what other things might it be able to treat that we currently can't?
Right, so I think the mRNA technology is almost 20 years old. People like Drew Weissman, Caitlin Carrico have been working, people like Lizzie Corbett, Barney Graham so Caitlin Carrico, Drew Weissman at Penn, Lizzie Corbett and Barney Graham and stuff at NIH. Because the Moderna's vaccine actually came out of NIH. The Pfizer vaccine came out of Penn, actually, and Pfizer. The mRNA technology, I think, has implications not only for vaccines, but also for gene therapy, for cancer therapy. I think we'll see, but I think the the door is wide open for what could happen. But certainly people are doing research looking to see whether the mRNA technology in the vaccine world can be a vaccine for AIDS, can be a vaccine for malaria, can be a better vaccine for tuberculosis. I think personally the biggest advance, this is going to surprise you, the biggest advance for the mRNA technology from my standpoint is that we have an enormous amount of experience with this vaccine in pregnant women. And that is not the usual story with vaccines. I mean, we have, and when Pfizer did their mRNA trial and Moderna did their mRNA trial, they excluded pregnant women from that trial, and that should have never happened. Pregnant women are 2.5 to 3-fold more likely to be hospitalized, to go to the ICU, to be put on a ventilator, and about 1.5-fold more likely to die of this virus than women of the same age who aren't pregnant. They should have been included in that trial. But now you have, hundreds of thousands of women who are pregnant who've gotten this vaccine. And you know that now the vaccine doesn't in any way affect either the pregnancy outcome or the neonatal outcome. And so that's great because there are other vaccines which can be given to pregnant women. And hopefully this platform will make it easier.
An interesting sidelight on the hubris modesty axis. I don't know if you are familiar with the story of Andreas Grünzig, who is one of the innovators of balloon angioplasty. He had experimental work in Switzerland with some of the original cardiologists who were doing this. But when he brought it to Emory, he actually angioplastied himself. So I've always found that to be a really fascinating comment, that he knew what he was doing was experimental, but he was willing to put himself at risk.
I think that's a usual story. I mean, a lot of Jonas Salk vaccinated his children very early. Will Offit, my son, was very early to get a rotavirus vaccine before it was a licensed product. So we're always willing to, sacrifice our family in the name of, He's fine, by the way.
Paul, I have a question. I lost my mother to Alzheimer's disease in 2004. My mother died in 2007. In one very early part of your book, you mentioned the possibility of an Alzheimer's vaccine. Can you talk a little bit about that and what a trial might look like and a timeline and where we are with sort of dealing with that very, very horrible disease?
Yeah, I think largely disappointing. I think the early work has not panned out. I mean, hopefully we'll have more information as we go forward, but for right now, I would say nothing that is moments away from being any sort of product. Sorry, sadly.
Anna? Anna Meadows from CHOP.
Long gone from CHOP. In the early 1970s, when I started treating children with cancer, first of all, you realize that children rarely get cancer. It's very unusual. It's not like polio. So there was a small group of children, and there were some hospitals that were treating children with cancer. And they realized that they were not going to make any progress unless they all got together and actually used clinical trials with all the children in the United States, Canada, and sometime Australia, to decide whether the treatments they were giving when 90% of the children would die of their cancer, the treatments that they began to invent were going to make a difference. Fast forward to today. Now 90% of children survive cancer. They're cured, essentially. But some of them have long-term effects of the treatment. And so in the 80s, one of the ways we decided to alter therapy was to reduce some of the therapy that we saw was causing side effects. I'm telling you all of this because these clinical trials involved a great investment in time and energy to get so-called informed consent. And I think this was a problem in the Jesse Gelsinger story, that the informed consent was not rigorous enough. That was the problem. Maybe you don't remember that, Paul, but I remember that because I was in the process of breaking my back to try to get informed consent from parents who would agree to giving their children less therapy than the therapy we knew was successful. Why? Because we knew that some of this therapy was going to produce long-term effects, and we didn't want children with cognitive deficits. So we stopped irradiating heads. And they still do it in another northern institution in our country because it makes for more cures, but it causes severe disability. So can you imagine how much time we spent talking to parents to say, would you be willing to enroll your child in this randomized study where half the children get cranial radiation and they're sure to be cured of their leukemia, and the other half do not, because we don't want them to be cognitively disabled? That took a long time and a big effort. And of course, there's always the question of litigation.
Yeah, here's what I would say. I spent a lot of time reading through the informed consent story with the Jesse Gelsinger trial. So do me a favor, if you get a chance to read the book, read that and tell me whether you still think that's true. Because I thought he was unfairly treated for the informed consent story. But read it in the book and see whether you agree. There's one thing that's interesting to me on the whole chemotherapy business was that Sidney Farber, who is certainly considered a brilliant pathologist and for whom the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute is named, he did an early trial because he believed that folic acid actually could be a treatment for acute lymphocytic or lymphoblastic leukemia. Because of a couple papers that had been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where the word folic acid was used, although it was used in quotes. Folic acid's a growth promoter, so why would it work for leukemia? And in fact, the 11 or so children who he treated with folic acid did much worse, which is not easy to do in the 1940s when children didn't live a year. He was able to actually hasten their deaths with the treatment of folic acid. And then he realized that he shouldn't have been treating with folic acid. This was the serendipity part. He should have been treating with the folic acid inhibitor, like aminopterin, and now methotrexate. And so what's interesting to me was the first adult to receive methotrexate. I don't know if you know this story, but the first adult to receive methotrexate, this folic acid inhibitor, was a New York Yankee who wore the number 3 on his back, Babe Ruth.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know what you make of the NIH initiative in precision medicine, the All of Us thing that has been attempting actually for some time now to recruit 1 million participants.
I'm going to turn to Ron for that answer.
I wish I had a good response to that, Bob, but I don't. We've seen things over the past couple of years where there's been a loss of trust in our scientific organizations. Part of the reason I asked Paul about the polio story was I think that if COVID had affected the numbers of children that it had, like polio, we'd have a different storyline about COVID. But I think I will say that my own personal experience at the FDA has been at times frustrating, but what I do appreciate is there's a huge effort. People are working very hard to support public health, and I think people are passionate about it. I think clearly there are missteps, We've seen the missteps in the last 2 years. But I still think, I think we're headed in the right place.
Last question.
This is a very quick question. What happened to Jim Wilson?
So Jim Wilson thrived because he stuck to it. What he did was he created a series of so-called adenovirus-associated vectors that were much more benign and, more importantly, were targeted, where you could target it to the brain, target it to the eye, target it to the liver. So he actually made, and he was very generous about those vectors and was willing to distribute them to other researchers. I think he's a hero to me, Jim Wilson, I think, in that story.
I mean, he's not doing clinical trials anymore, you know, as you point out.
No, I
in the
think
book,
he got
was-
the death sentence, as they say.
He was never allowed to do a clinical trial again, but he stuck with trying to figure out what went wrong, and as Paul commented, that led to the success of Carl June's therapies and other therapies.
Gentlemen.
Read the book. It's an
This-
interesting book.
That's right, don't listen to me.
The nice
Read it.
guest in orange has been very persistent about putting their hands up, so this truly is the last question.
There was an interesting article in Science recently talking about docs who are obstetricians, and they, during the births, if they have a problem, that they switch. So they're looking at the win, stay, and the lose shift motion is a very interesting thing, and it violates in some ways looking at heuristics. You guys use a lot of data in trials to see what you can actually do, but in something like a transplant, there's a number of human decisions that are made on that. Is there a way around that, or especially for something like a transplant itself?
A way around?
Around, the human error that comes into fact there, because they're talking in the article, which just piqued my interest in this, that you have a choice of either giving a C-section or a vaginal birth.
I see.
And docs that had a problem with, a vaginal birth went to a C-section to the next one and made a decision to do that. But it was not anything that was necessarily driven by their, their training and such. So for the large trials, when you're looking at data, that's something that, you can play with the data also, but any thoughts on what I've...
Yeah, these are human endeavors, and humans are flawed. So I'm not sure that there's ever any getting away around the fact that there are the errors that or misrepresentations, willful or otherwise, in these efforts.
Won't you join me in thanking our two gentlemen this evening? It's been terrific. There are copies of Paul's book for purchase at the back of the room, and he's graciously said he'll stay for a few minutes and sign them and personalize them. It's a terrific read and accessible to historians who don't know anything in humanists. So I encourage all of you to take a look at the book, and thank you again very much.
Sure, thank you.
All right.